Today is St. Patrick's Day, and we're marking the occasion with the history of the holiday. Mark Cronin's new book, The Wearing of the Green, traces the annual March 17th festivities back to the 5th century, when St. Patrick converted the pagan Irish to Christianity. You'll also learn of the origins and development of the holiday in Ireland, America, Australia, Canada, and Britain, with today's traditional parades dating back to the 19th century. It's just over half an hour.
I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's guest, Mike Cronin, joining us all the way from Leicester, England. He's a historian and author of 2 books, The History of Ireland and his new book, The Wearing of the Green, The History of St. Patrick's Day. I'd like you to give a warm Borders welcome to Mike Cronin.
Thank you. I'm just going to talk for about 15 minutes, just generally about the book and some of the ideas relating to St. Patrick's Day, both here in Chicago, America, and elsewhere in the world. A few people have said to us, you know, this is a really strange book to write. I mean, a whole book on St. Patrick's Day, does it deserve a whole book? Because I think most people think, well, yeah, it's there like Christmas, it's like Valentine's Day, it's this once-a-year event. And we know the form, you know, you stick on your green clothes, you maybe go in a parade, have a pint of green beer, and that's pretty much your day sorted out. And Darryl and myself, I mean, my co-author is an Australian guy who was over in Dublin with me about 4 or 5 years ago. And suffice to say, and I'll own up to it, it's not big or clever, we got hideously drunk. And we got into this ridiculous conversation with an even drunker old Irish guy about what the great unwritten Irish history book was. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, it seemed completely rational that a history of St. Patrick's Day was the thing to do with our lives. And the next morning, we kind of scratched our heads, and in the sort of cold light of day, we thought, no, this is just too stupid to be true. Because surely there must be a whole raft of books out there that have been written on St. Patrick's Day, you know, be it globally or in specific countries. And the surprising thing is, and this was the real inspiration to actually get going, was there isn't. There's a few specific books on, for example, some of the older parades like in New York and so on. But there's nothing that's actually tried to deal with St. Patrick's Day globally. And really, what are we talking about here? I mean, Mary Robinson, when she became the Irish president in 1990, made a speech on Irish TV which sort of inaugurated her kind of term in office. And the one thing she said to basically an Irish camera crew was, I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to the 70 million people around the world who claim to be Irish. So the Irish really are kind of one of the biggest diasporas in the world. And St. Patrick's Day itself now, I think, has taken on this route of being kind of globally spread. There is no other national festival or any other Saints' Day which is so widely celebrated. Hugely important. So just an example, not only have you got all the events going on in America and in Chicago this weekend, you guys have 2, of course. Why you can't have just 1 like everybody else, I've never... But look, I was talking to one of the sales reps for Guinness in Ireland the other week, and he said, oh, yeah, he said, we've organised 4 big events in Beijing this year. So I'm not sure how kind of Chinese people go down with Guinness. He said, oh, they love it, you know. But also, I mean, for example, in Lagos in Nigeria, they have a huge parade. There's one in Red Square in Moscow. And pretty much everywhere you look, especially if you go onto the websites, you get into this weird and wonderful virtual world of St. Patrick's Day. And it really is everywhere. So that's kind of fairly obvious, and we found that quite quickly. But the question then was really, how the hell do you write a book and try and put into some kind of coherent thought a history of St. Patrick's Day? Because it does have one. It's not just a history of the previous 4 hours when you wake up in the morning and think, bad hangover. So where do you start? How do we do it? And in the end, Darren and I decided what we'd do, we'd look at the big countries of, you know, the Irish diaspora, and also Britain, Ireland, America, Canada, Australia were the 5 we chose. There's kind of a nodding acquaintance in the book to other big countries such as Argentina, South Africa and elsewhere that have very big Irish communities. So that was the easy thing. Geographically, we've got this sorted. The next big trip was really to figure out, well, OK, where did it start, and who the hell was this guy, St. Patrick, anyway? I remember having a meeting with Darryl when I was in Australia a couple of years ago, and we were having a chat about this. And his wife kind of shouted from the sofa, he's just like Santa Claus, except he wears green. He's everywhere and everybody loves him. Probably a good way of thinking about it. So So we had this image of this kind of green guy with a big beard wandering around. So who was he? First of all, St Patrick wasn't even Irish, he was Welsh. He was a slave. He was taken by Viking marauders, as they're described, and transplanted to Ireland, where he was a shepherd boy. Now, whether it was being out in a cold or because of divine intervention, but St Patrick, or Patrick as he was then, believed that angels came and visited him and said, run away and train as a cleric. So Patrick fled Ireland and left his sheep behind. Who looked after them, nobody knows, but presume they're okay. And Patrick travelled to France, where he trained as in the priesthood. Angel number 2 came down, and obviously Patrick and the angels had a very good relationship. Patrick travelled back to Ireland, where his lasting testimony is that he obviously brought Christianity to Ireland. And really did, in a way, kill the sort of pagan religions that had been existent in Ireland for many centuries before. It's reputed St Patrick lived till he was 114. Some people claim he was 134 when he died, so, you know, had a good life. 17th of March, there's a wonderful line in one of the, there's 2 big books, or tracts, as it were, of St Patrick's writings that were discovered and propagated in the church after his death. And one of those sort of arguments was that the 17th of March was the day that St Patrick fell asleep. Lovely kind of concept, not dying, fell asleep. So that's why the 17th of March is the day we celebrate. One thing we found in the book, which was a wonderful selection of files in the Dublin archives. Dublin's big argument is that St Patrick's Day is one of their huge tourist opportunities. This is a day they can get people like you to come and spend, you know, hard currency in Ireland and make them all even richer. But the one thing that really held the Irish government back was they realised the weather in Ireland is appalling. You know, it's probably on a par with Chicago. It's windy, it rains, it's not very nice. And in the 1960s, the Irish government actually held a commission which got into a whole series of correspondence with the Vatican. And the Irish government brought together all these academics who kind of read everything that there was about St Patrick and looked at all the myths and the legends and the bits of writings that he'd left behind. You know, dear Vatican, I think he died in August because it's nicer then. And there was this huge series, and it is a just genuine file that went on for 2 years, of the Irish government trying to convince the Vatican that the 17th of March has never been fixed as the real date of his falling asleep, and something more amenable like June, July or August would be great by them. In the end, the Irish government, I think the Vatican, is a wonderfully diplomatic letter, but you read between the lines, it says, look, stop being stupid and just get on with it, kind of thing. So they admitted defeat, and the 17th of March it is. All the myths, I mean, obviously, again, St Patrick has, very much like Santa Claus, actually, this kind of mythology around him, as well as being a very serious and very revered religious man who had a huge impact on the history of Christianity. You have the stories, obviously, the snakes being chased out. I saw a wonderful Hallmark card yesterday, which was, you know, why did the snakes leave Ireland? And it's kind of all the snakes running away, followed by this St Patrick. And St Patrick saying, tastes like chicken. So there are no snakes in Ireland still to this day, but I mean, obviously, you do have this myth that's sort of built around him, one of which is key, which explains in part the whole green idea, is St Patrick using the shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity. And this is why the shamrock became hugely important in Irish life. And you see from really about the first records we find are about the 1100s, that early, you know, 900 years ago. There are writings describing people wearing the shamrock, and also one of the other great traditions that began, which links St Patrick's Day not only with the shamrock and the wearing of the green, which was reminiscent of the shamrock and Irish nationalism, but also, again, in the 1100s, 1200s, a wonderful thing called the wetting of the shamrock, or the drowning of the shamrock, which is the tradition where people wore their shamrock all day, and at the end of the day they dropped it into a glass of whiskey or whatever they were drinking and drank their shamrock. And therein lay a whole history of kind of Irish alcoholism, probably, but there's all these kind of, it's very interesting the way that we found through St Patrick's Day, all these kind of myths and legends of the man himself are represented by people who are parading the way the day is celebrated today. As for the hard history, Boston wins hands down, unfortunately. Sorry, Chicago. People in Boston, when I told them this, like, yes! You know? 1737 is the first big St. Patrick's Day gathering, as it were, the first public one in Boston, which was a charitable society. It was brought together, strange enough, by Irish Protestants. Again, this is one of the people instantly presume that St. Patrick's Day is a linkage between Irish people and Catholicism. Pretty much generally, most cities, certainly in America, but also in Australia as well, where you see the first parades, the first celebrations, the first charitable dinners, they're usually actually Irish Protestant immigrants rather than Catholic ones who actually start it. There are these kind of elite dinners where they come together and eat for Ireland. They eat these huge dinners. The idea is at the end they give a few dollars which gets sent back to the people in Ireland who don't have anything to eat, but probably makes their consciences feel better. The first parades, again, there's a tradition shortly before the American War of Independence of Irish troops serving in the British Army to march on St. Patrick's Day. It seems there's some great descriptions in the archives and things and people's letters of you have the important commander of the local garrison who wakes up in the morning and the troops are marching up and down outside of his house. These are some of the first parades, these kind of troop marches, just going back and forth. And the idea is, obviously, the commander eventually just has to give them money to go away so they can go and get drunk. And there does seem to be this kind of military essence to it. And I think that's why the parade became so important. And certainly in Boston, the whole link between Evacuation Day on the 17th of March and St. Patrick's Day is very, very important. Once the parades are up and going, I mean, they really do spread like wildfire, that the Irish community as a whole across the world, as in the diaspora, really uses these, uses the day as a way of marking their presence. And I think this became vitally important in the years after the Irish famine. There was a whole tradition you've probably heard of in Ireland when people left and they had to wave goodbye to everybody, of the Irish wake. These big parties, these big gatherings before people got on the boat never to see home again or their families or anything like that. Thoroughly depressing things to read about, these families being torn apart by starvation and famine. What seems to have happened when the Irish community gathers together in the US or wherever else they end up is that St. Patrick's Day in a way forms part of an answer to the sadness of that Irish wake. This is a day of proud self-proclamation. You know, we're here, we're Irish, we're taking over in a way. And this is one of the important things I think about the parades, is the idea they are on the public highway, it's public space. And this is a way for the Irish could really say to communities around them, you know, you can't oppress us. It's one way is kind of showing off to the British that they've made it in a new country, but also it's dealing with local communities they find. So St. Patrick's Day forms this very important community bond. And I think as the generations go by and people still, you know, they may be less Irish, but the day is the one day they can be Irish. And then into the 20th century, you see this generation of people who have nothing to do with Irishness themselves, but can see a good party. And I think you do see this whole sucking up. One of the other things we'd found in the book, and which we discuss at length, is the whole idea of commercialisation of St. Patrick's Day. Just to give you a few random examples to show you how it changes during the 19th and 20th century, and really does broaden out to a much bigger celebration. First of all is the humble shamrock, obviously, which doesn't grow very easily in America. The first glasshouse grown shamrocks are grown in New York in the 1860s. There's a real problem with people in Ireland. They have this tradition of sending them all around the world. And you read some wonderful letters of, you know, Dear Mary, thank you for your gift of the shamrock, which had obviously been in a box in a boat for about 6 weeks. And it wasn't very well when it got here, but I wore it all day. The big thing that changed that, obviously, is in the 1950s is transatlantic air travel. Aer Lingus, Ireland's national airline, makes a fortune, makes a killing with some of its first flights of shipping this stuff over in great quantities and then selling it on the streets of New York and elsewhere. And the shamrock really does become synonymous with the whole day. The other thing is, obviously, beer is one of them. First beer commercials directly linking the idea of, you know, buy Beer X and enjoy St. Patrick's Day appear in the American press in 1904. And then more recently, obviously, Guinness has used the day, what's a polite way here, ruthlessly to promote their own products. And there's a wonderful thing as well, to linking in the global and the local. Guinness obviously has a very kind of clear, this is an Irish product. They sell it, as I say, around the world. The most wonderful descriptions we found was one of their big markets is in Nigeria. And there are Irish bars in Nigeria as well, in Lagos especially. So they had this idea of, this is in the 1990s, that, we'll send to all the Irish pubs around the world, inflatable shamrocks, banners they can put up and all these other things. And obviously somebody in an office in Dublin scratched their head and thought, well, will somebody in Nigeria know what to do with an inflatable shamrock? So you have the box of goodies that gets sent out, but then you have a sheet of instructions, inflate shamrock, do not eat, put on wall. And at that kind of global level, I mean, the other things as well are obviously the greetings cards. First greeting postcards appear in the 1890s. First greetings cards and envelopes around 1910 in America, and now obviously huge business. One last thing, just to sort of finish up briefly. We found, as well as all these big parades now, grand parades and so on, was we'd really tried to deal in the last chapter of the book with people's own ideas of what St. Patrick means, what St. Patrick's Day means. So we had a huge kind of internet questionnaire which was posted up about 2 years ago, and we got thousands of responses to it. There's only a few of them in the book, unfortunately. And also talked to anybody we met, and the first thing they say, what are you working on? History of St. Patrick's Day. And you can see them scratching their head thinking, OK, 3 intelligent things I can say to this person about St. Patrick's Day. One of them, which for yourselves is the great one, the most common thing that everybody said to us was, don't they dye the River Green in Chicago? So, the clever man who thought of that in 1962 had the right idea. Wonderful story. I mean, some of you probably know this, but I mean, obviously, the great thing reading about it was in 1962 when they had the idea of dyeing the river. They got the mix wrong at the first time. It stayed green for 6 days. Second time it was 3 days, and now they've got it pretty much perfectly. So, but these kind of private, I don't know, memories and people's view of it were, I think, the most kind of poignant part of the book, and also the most fascinating in a way that we are talking about these big structures, parades, charitable organisations and so on. But I now think, much probably different to where I started 4 years ago, that St. Patrick's Day is actually very deeply personal for most people in their celebrations. The idea that people will have family meals. Obviously the church service is hugely important. The idea that people who follow the Catholic faith, St. Patrick's Day quite often falls in the period of Lent, therefore it's a day of breaking of fasts and so on. And then the idea is these traditions of sending, I always send shamrock to my family in America, or, we gather together with old college friends, whatever it may be, and these kind of personal memories are hugely significant. And I think that's one thing everybody should maybe think through, the way they approach St. Patrick's Day. And within those, stories, there was some sort of wonderful kind of reminiscences. One in the book, which was a guy who, no relation to mine, another Mike Cronin, who grew up in England. And in England, St. Patrick's Day, especially with the politics of Northern Ireland, was not something that was celebrated. It was a very difficult thing to celebrate. The British kind of very much frowned upon it because the Irish shouldn't be out publicly kind of parading their wares. And this guy who emigrated to Britain from the west of Ireland in the 1950s, you can imagine some sort of scruffy little 7-year-old boy with tousled hair, and mother proudly stuck a piece of shamrock on his lapel and sent him out to school. And this was a kind of very rough school in a sort of working class area of London. And he kind of wrote to us and said, I remember walking into school and this kind of big bruiser walked up to me, poked me in the chest and said, why are you wearing watercress? And he said, I proudly, kind of all my Irish heritage came out, and I proudly said to him, no, it's shamrock. And the guy said, what the hell's shamrock? At which point he thumped him anyway, so... I think one final sort of, I think, strange one, which probably equates the bizarre relationship between Ireland, who now... Ireland obviously considered itself the home of St. Patrick and the home of St. Patrick's Day. And you always talk to people in Ireland, they now have this amazing 4-day cultural festival, which is, if you've ever got an opportunity to go, it is actually quite fantastic. And they have fireworks displays and culture and drama, and then the actual parade itself. But you always get the feeling the Irish who kind of look enviously, in a way, to Irish America, in a way they kind of almost know they do it better over here than they do at home. except for one exception, and I'm going to probably offend a lot of people here now. St. Patrick's Day food. One thing the Irish cannot get their head around is the corned beef and cabbage thing. There's a wonderful quote somewhere of Gerry Adams, sort of, when he comes to... Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness, can't remember which one, but one of the sort of big dinners at the White House, and you see these guys who've grown up on the streets of Northern Ireland and finally get their way into the White House. Big dinner. What's on the menu? I've made it. In Ireland, it's bacon and cabbage, not corned beef and cabbage. And even there, most Irish people wouldn't eat it. So, anyway, enjoy your corned beef, enjoy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you.
Do we have some questions for Mr. Cronin? Nobody wants to go first.
Do they dye the beer green everywhere or just in Chicago?
It's a very North American thing, actually. It seems to have been a tradition, as far as we can say, sort of seems to have started in about the 1920s, when Irish Americans seem to have got this obsession with everything had to be green. Green bagels now, green noodles, green noodles. No, it's a statewide thing. The Canadians do it as well. The pitiful thing is, you see for tourists, they try and do it in Dublin. Now, there's one thing dyeing a kind of like beer, a pint of Guinness, it doesn't work. You have this drop of green in the top, and it's not good. So no, it seems it's a very American thing, but it's hugely popular. So yeah, I would imagine that's kind of probably got a history of about 80 years now. But I think there's, all food stuffs are now in green. I mean, we had, again, with these letters people sent in, of somebody saying, you know, my friend made the biggest kind of culinary mistake ever. They brought creme de menthe cookies to the... So, you know, some things work, some things don't.
Mayor Daley was the one that decided on that, and his son is mayor now, too.
And the amazing thing, I didn't mention it earlier, the amazing thing about Chicago, which we never really got to the bottom of, and I mean, I think somebody, if somebody's looking for a sort of pastime, they should write a history of St. Patrick's Day in Chicago. The parades start in about the 1840s here, so that pretty much fits in with the rest of America for big open parades. But in 1869, the parade stops, and there's kind of political wranglings within Chicago, and that's the reason why it dies out. But then it never restarts. It's not until Mayor Daley begins it in the 1950s. And obviously the South Side Parade starts again the year later, 53 and 54. And I say now you have two. You do have this kind of linkage between Mayor Daley and the Irish community and the Chicago Parade. But I mean, I think it's sad that somewhere with such the tradition that Chicago had of an Irish community, and a very big one, you know, lost a parade for 90 years. But I mean, as I say, that's probably why you've got two now to make up for it, so it works out very well. But they're great parades here. I think the river dyeing, that was fantastic. Because the other thing as well, it's great when you show people pictures, because I think in their mind when they think dye a river green, they think they're going to get some kind of murky, not quite green thing. Green. Wonderful.
What makes Boston's St. Patrick's Day better than Chicago's?
Nothing, I wouldn't think. It's just... No, I didn't say it's better, it's just older. So, no, I mean, I think the one thing, the amazing thing we did find was that, and it's certainly something, talking to people who've sort of seen the book and so on, is that you pick out certain parades and certain stories, and you explain when they started and what happened and how they might have changed and so on. The one thing we're aware of, so many people have come up to us and said, well, you know, what about my town, village, you know, we only have 100 people, but it's great, and we have all these traditions. Every parade is so different. You wouldn't think the idea of just getting, you know, 20,000 Irish people to walk down the street could be that different. But there are so many local traditions, the route being traditional, the role of the sort of local archbishop, whatever it may be, there's all these little nuances in each particular city. I mean, in a way, be honest, that's one thing we said right at the beginning of the book, you know, this is not definitive, because there's no way we could deal with all these different parades. There's a great one in, and you also, I mean, as you say, you know, why is it better? You do get into this kind of, I don't know, one-upmanship of, you know, we've got the biggest, the longest, the widest, and the best. The best one is Dripsey in County Cork had this huge thing on the front of the Irish Times about 3 years ago because they had invented the shortest. And it's two pubs that are next door to each other. And they just go out of one pub and into the next one. And last year they had 2,500 people doing a 30-yard parade.
Does Australia do anything unique? I was somewhat surprised to hear that they had major St. Patrick's Day celebrations.
Australia has an amazing, I mean, it has a huge Irish population. It probably had, certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, the most politicised parades anywhere in the world. They had a referendum in Australia in 1916 about whether or not to join the First World War. A very famous Catholic archbishop called Archbishop Mannix campaigned with the Catholic community against joining the First World War and fighting for Britain. So the parade after the end of the war was seen as disloyal, as problematic. There was many kind of riots around the parade and big political football it turned into. And that's never really disappeared, this kind of politicisation of the parades. And they've constantly been legislated against. If the kind of city council changes and it has somebody who's kind of anti-Irish on it, you know, the parade gets banned for a few years until the government changes and so on. In recent years, they've gone out of fashion. I mean, the one thing with Sydney has, in the first week of March, it's huge gay Mardi Gras, which probably gets somewhere around 1 million people turn up for it. And this is one thing now, the Sydney St. Patrick's Day Parade has really collapsed because it just can't compete. The city's not prepared to close the streets and so on. So what sort of seems to have happened in recent years in Australia is the Irish community has, in a way, turned in on itself. That they're much more involved in smaller parades in local areas, things like big sports days, they play Gaelic football and so on. A lot of music, that kind of thing. It's, in a way, it's sad because the size of the community, it's actually gone small scale. But that's very much a product of the sort of the politics of kind of the Irish community within Australia. So at least they get the sunshine.
Anybody else have a question?
Do you have any idea where we got corned beef from? Why we think it's Irish?
Where? What comes from?
Corned beef. Why do you know where that came from?
As far as we can figure out, the corned beef thing seems to have been, it's just a cheap substitute. You read letters from Irish immigrants to America in around the kind of 1850s, 1860s, that kind of post-war period, and then certainly into the turn of the century, where they constantly talk about the kind of celebrations they're doing over here compared to really how dull it is in Ireland at the time. And they do talk about this kind of thing called corned beef. That, I mean, nobody in Ireland had a clue what corned beef was at that time. And it does seem to be that some people do write that, you know, that bacon or kind of a purer meat is expensive and this is just a substitute. So you can't pin it down, but you just get the impression it became a head of steam, that this was then just a traditional dish, that's what everybody had always eaten, therefore it's still there. So, you know, it'd be nice to pin it down better, but it's certainly the sort of the longer history of it.
What are you referring to as bacon? When I think of bacon in Europe, I think of James Herriot in this nothing but fat.
It's bacon. It's big fatty piece of ham. Yeah. It's not like rashers of bacon. It's at breakfast. It's big fatty bits of ham.
Okay.
Not very nice.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a better piece of meat than corned beef.
Well, yeah, it's a neat point. I think that's the thing. The Irish themselves now don't eat either of them. They go and eat something else. So.
Did my grandmother lie to me all these years? I thought St. Patrick's was a very religious holiday in Ireland, where you spent the whole day praying for the heathens who had to move to America.
How old is she, or was she? No, I mean, that's the thing, joking apart. There's clearly the Irish state, when it comes together, I mean, it was a very religious holiday. It's also a very political forum, certainly in the years when the British were there. And still has been political in the north of Ireland. When you look at when the Irish state was formed in 1921-22, you would have thought they had this big day. They would have really sort of gone for something flamboyant and extravagant. All they actually organised was a state mass on St. Patrick's morning. That every government minister had to be there. You know, you had to do it. So it was a huge day of sort of Catholic observation. I mean, to reinforce that again, I mean, the one image that most people have is of beer and so on. From 1922 until 1966, every single pub was closed in Ireland on St Patrick's Day. It was a dry day, it was very much a religious day. It's something the Westmeath Examiner said in the 1950s. It's like every other day in Ireland except Dulla. The only place you could get a drink was the Royal Dublin Dog Show, had a licence. So you get people like Brendan Behan write this thing, you know, I'd never cared for how dogs look like, but I could get a drink there, so I'm into dogs that day. So, hugely important. It still is important. I mean, obviously, church masses and so on take place, will this Sunday take place across Ireland. And it really is linked into the sort of whole thing of Lent and so on. I mean, just to give you a perception of, you know, people always, especially modern Ireland, there's a whole debate about how secular it's become, you know, is the Catholic Church still there and so on. I was there on Ash Wednesday this year, and I was going out to one of the universities in Dublin. So you think, you know, okay, these young people, 18, 21, 22, if there was a secular group, this is it. And I would imagine probably 40, 50% of them had, you know, been to church and sort of had the cross on their forehead. So it is still incredibly kind of religious sort of country. So yeah, St Patrick's Day church services will be important, but they're just one part of the day now. You know, there's still then the sort of fun and so on in the afternoon. She wasn't lying.
Anybody else?
How do you yourself choose to celebrate St. Patrick's Day?
I mean, it's a strange thing. I mean, obviously, with growing up in England, I didn't. It's a simple fact. I mean, I was amazed before I came over here the other week, I went into a kind of stationery shop, and it's the first time I can remember seeing St Patrick's Day greeting cards in England. So I would imagine the first time that I ever probably did anything was probably in my, well, God, mid-20s, when finally, and that was much more to do with the whole Guinness thing in England, of Irish theme bars started opening up everywhere, and therefore, you know, St Patrick's Night was one of the big nights out. This year in particular, I'm actually going to be in Dublin, so I will go and watch the parade and have a few beers with some friends and enjoy myself. So.
Anybody else? Oh.
Have you been to our Southside Parade?
Can you wait just a second? Say it again.
Have you been to our Southside Parade?
This is a horrible kind of self-admission thing. No. This thing, it's one thing actually. Everybody you talk to always says, "No, have you been to our parade?" And if I'd been to everybody's parade, I'd be about as old as St Patrick when he died, kind of thing. So, people keep inviting me, so I think I could dedicate the rest of the march of the rest of my life coming back to people's parade. I would love to see more of them. What we did do, actually, to joking aside, was we watched a lot of things on. So many of them are now sort of fed down the internet by web cameras and so on. We probably watched, I would imagine, well over a sort of 150, 200 parades around the world, either on kind of newsreel footage or photographs, web cameras and so on. So we've seen a lot, and I have seen the Southside one. It was about that big on a computer screen, but it looked great. Yeah.
Anybody else? Thank you very much for coming.
No problem.
And we'll move you over to the signing table.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Something else to drink.
Mike Cronin is author of The Wearing of the Green, A History of St. Patrick's Day. It's published by Routledge. Visit routledge-ny.com for more information.